Joseph Lindsley is a traveller and writer, and until recently had achieved a unique function in broadcasting by reporting on Chicago's WGN radio from Ukraine each and every weekday of Russia's full-scale war. Although that has now ended, Joe is still in Ukraine. He remains there to help the world understand what is at stake in this fight, the nature of Ukrainian freedom, and what we can learn from Volya, that is the Ukrainian will or volition to win and be free and not be coerced and controlled. Before we jump in, thank you to everybody who helped support our recent trip to Ukraine. And as you know, we have many other events and trips lined up, as well as the filming of our documentary film, which is now proceeding apace. And I do owe the audience a big catch up on that one. And that is definitely coming because we're about to set filming dates for that, which is incredibly exciting. Thank you all. And if you've helped on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee, then I am extremely grateful. Joe, while we're in Ukraine, while we're in Lviv, we had the pleasure of having a rather long and boozy discussion, and I'm hoping we can reprise some of those issues for the audience today.
Yeah, Jonathan, it was great to see you here just a few days ago in the excellent city of Lviv, and we figured out a lot of problems, I think, and to figure out how do we navigate these next weeks in particular. And one thing that I have really been thinking about is we can get caught up in all the bad news and the argumentation, and I think as I was just running through Lviv an hour ago, remembering we have to remember some very simple things, and for me, it's that everything I'm doing is trying to help Americans, especially those in Washington, understand what really is at stake here and what's happening, and to help people in Ukraine understand how to talk to Americans. Because for me, that's the most. I mean, other people can deal with Europe, but I think that the best hope is. I still believe that we need America, and that actually it's possible. I'm not of the position that we can, there's just a neutral option. I really think we can actually have a transformation, and that's what I work toward. And I think in this, the most basic concept, which I sometimes I've drifted away from, but I've known this for years, is the idea of an analytical empathy. And I encourage people to. I mean, I've taken this as my guidebook. This book on the problem of empathy by Edith Stein, who was killed in Auschwitz. She wrote this. It was her doctoral thesis at the University of Freiburg in Germany under Husserl, the famous philosopher. She was one of his best students. She was one of the most brilliant philosophers of the 20th century. She wrote this book on the problem of empathy and sort of showing us how empathy is a rigorous analytical tool that you can use if you're communicating with someone. You go through this process called brackets, where you remove your own biases and your own anger and your own vision, and you first understand to whom you are speaking, and in a genuine way. It can never be in a condescending way, or it doesn't work. You actually have to really try to say, why does this person believe this or that idea, and you go back, keep reducing it until you find sort of the thing that makes sense to you, and then from there you can begin to construct a conversation. And this idea of empathy, I've been reading that book, especially when I would go to Eastern Ukraine. For some reason, I would read it, in bomb shelters and on those trips to the East, when I was desperately looking for a way. How do we communicate what's actually happening here to America, to Americans, and how do we get pro-Ukraine people to understand America, so that we can actually get to a solution, a positive one for Ukraine. And so I've been reading this book for several years and rereading it and, working through it. And in the past several months, Jonathan, as we discussed in Lviv, it's very interesting. Elon Musk and a few other sort of tech people, as well as like Christian MAGA pastors, have been precisely attacking this idea of empathy, which is strange to me. And they attack it as sort of a fluffy emotion that is very poisonous and dangerous. But Edith Stein, everything that she wrote, it's not fluff. Sympathy is more fluffy. Empathy, as she described it, it's an analytical process, and it's notable that the people who are really attacking empathy, there's a little bit from MAGA pastors, but again, especially some of the technocrats. And if you look at this idea, and I'll just mention this at the beginning here, because it might seem off topic, but I think it's inherently related to this. We look at this idea of singularity and what's happening with AI. And And I think increasingly the only way to really tell what's human in every sense of the word and what's not human is empathy, the capacity to have empathy, to really understand with whom you are speaking. And that's the only way we can have a conversation or a democracy. And if you the what we're facing though with sort of the governance of AI and it's its own type of tyranny, that is becomes an affront against human dignity. And this is related to Ukraine precisely for this, because so Ukraine's revolution in 2014 is a revolution of dignity. And for a few years, I didn't, okay, it's a nice idea, but why dignity? And now I really see this clearly. I've seen it, you know, even in President Zelenskyy, when he was speaking with Ben Shapiro, and Shapiro was asking about the White House interview, Zelenskyy said, yeah, he got frustrated because he felt his dignity had been violated. And for Ukrainians, this idea of dignity really matters. The dignity of the human, and that's why they don't worship the state. You know, Moscow. You look at the May 9th parade in Moscow. That is the pure worship of the state. Everything is subsumed into the Kremlin, even the church. And for Ukrainians, it's they kind of hate the state. They don't trust it. It's all about the person, personalism. And so that part of the story gets missed. It hasn't been really told, but I think now we have a chance because dignity is under a new type of threat from technology, from AI, and very notably, and almost all of the media, perhaps all of it, has missed this fact. Pope Leo, when he after he became Pope, the next day, he was explaining why he chose the name Leo. And almost everyone says it's because of this document Rerum Novarum, the new things, and that is, you know, and that's all about labor unions. Oh, so he's the Pope of the labor unions. That's not what he said. He said the main reason, he said there's other reasons why he chose the name, but the main thing is because Leo the 13th, in writing Rerum Novarum on the new things, was first and foremost finding a way, showing the world a way to protect human dignity with back then, which were the twin threats of unfettered capitalism and socialism and communism. These are both threats to human dignity as responses to the Industrial Revolution. And so Leo the 14th, the new Leo, he explicitly has said that he has chosen this name to help guide us to protect human dignity in the age of artificial intelligence. And so this is so not many people see this, but this is exactly, you know, Elon sees, I mean, he thinks singularity is approaching in like 3 years. Maybe that's why he doesn't care about what's happening here and other places. But Leo is one of the few people on the other side who says we need to be prepared for this. But very notably, you know, Ukrainians, like this is all about human dignity. It's, you know, people would rather die than give up this idea of dignity, than live under tyranny. And I think so much of us in the middle, including in America, you know, we have this freedom rhetoric, but we've lost the sense of what like real dignity is. And so that's really what I think is at stake here. And I think if, you know, with this idea of this analytical empathy, we can better share this concept of of human dignity that Ukrainians are fighting for and defending in a way that will get Americans to rally around the cause.
This is fascinating because it seems to me that at the moment, one of the problems is not just speaking to Americans, it's actually understanding that many Americans have lost the ability to speak to each other. And I think you have people say on the left screaming at Trump and his cohorts, saying that their behavior is denying them dignity, but actually you see zero empathy for it. You have the accusation that, you know, the Republicans are acting in an extremely transactional way, and in many respects they are, and that looking at democracy as a process to overturn in some respect. But actually, when you look at the Democrat side, they're equally quite happy to deny the agency or dignity of the other side and to see things as a transactional process and behave quite transactionally towards their own values. It's almost like a degradation, actually, of the entire system, the entire dialogue. And I think Hannah Arendt, I think it was, who said that actually the first indicators of authoritarianism are not people being locked up, are not books being burnt or writers being shut up behind bars, or worse, it's actually the inability of people to empathize with each other. Empathy is the first thing to go before you have some form of civilizational decline. And what we see in Russia, of course, is almost the complete absence of empathy, not just for the suffering of Ukrainians, but actually for the suffering of each other. Russians are too tied up in their own trauma, and that's part of the purpose. That's part of the authoritarian mechanism. That if you are too traumatized and too focused on your own trauma, you really aren't able to empathize with others. And unfortunately, I see some of those characteristics of the Russian authoritarian system creeping into the dialogue in the US. And of course, Ukraine's got trapped in the middle of that. So how do you get out? I mean, you're very intent, of course, on trying to empathize and communicate with Republicans because they hold the reins of power right now. And like it or not, there's nothing anyone can do about that. You have to talk to those who have the power and have the resources if the main objective is to help Ukraine. But on this wider issue of empathy and dignity and the breakdown of dialogue, what could be done about there, and particularly in the context of Ukraine?
Well, I think firstly we recognize the very reason why Republicans and why Trump and MAGA, which in some ways is a new party, really, why they hold the power, and it's because to some degree they did practice the exercise of empathy with the American people. They read the mood and they responded to it, and I think a lot of people, a lot of Europeans in particular, and sort of Washington elites, sort of miss this because they're not talking to the people in the same way. I mean, remember Trump went on like 12 of the most popular podcasts that people like truckers and everyone listens to. Kamala didn't. She was removed from the people. And if you want to win, you have to actually understand the people in a democracy. And the same thing applies to Ukraine. That's what I say to Ukrainians. If you want American support, you have to almost promote Ukraine like an old school presidential campaign, but old school, but with the new technology and new understanding. So I think firstly is recognizing the reason why Republicans are in power is not just some kind of like thing that came down from Mount Sinai. It's because it's responding to the actual moods of the people, and we see this on display the past week with all the stories now coming out about from the left and from sort of legacy primary media, including the Washington Post, heavily critical of Joe Biden and his team. Like the gloves are off, and I think this is the main criticism is oh well, it looks like Joe Biden was not mentally fit, even though we were all told he was. And so we were lied to or misled. People were debating to which degree, it was dishonest or accidental. But the Washington Post had an editorial. Jake Tapper of CNN has a book now about this, saying that because this was a major concern of MAGA for years, was that the Joe Biden wasn't fit and to govern, and they were told to stop talking. They were actually shut down. In fact, Jake Tapper went on Megyn Kelly's show this past week, and he said that he actually called Laura Trump and apologized to her because on air like a year ago she was questioning Biden's mental fitness, and Jake Tapper mocked her, and so he said he had to call her and apologize. This is quite astounding. I don't think anyone could have imagined Jake Tapper calling Laura Trump a year ago to apologize, and so I think what we're seeing in some ways is some of the elites trying to find a way to, well, if almost everyone now has realized in the U.S., if you want to survive politically, you got to disown the Biden years, and you have to move away from it and show you're separate from it. And it's interesting, Jonathan, because that's precisely what I've been saying to Ukrainians for about 4 months, is you have to separate yourself from Joe Biden. You have to do it. And we can go into the details of why, if you wish.
Yeah, we'll come to that in a minute, definitely, because everyone watching this will know that I'm not. I'm sort of my partisanship is that, as you know, I mean, my belief is that neither candidate was fit for office based on their mode of speaking, and on Biden, it's a certain level of incapacity, but also strategic failure. But we'll come to failure of strategy and leadership. On Trump, I've never heard him put a coherent sentence together, even though I will accept there are some interesting ideas behind it and an ability to tap into certain empathy and problems and utilize them. But, hopefully I'm coming at this from someone who doesn't have a horse in the race, as it were. I don't get a vote, and I'm equally cynical about both candidates. But I'll let you continue on that one because we are going to dive into that.
Well, I mean, so I've been saying for months that it's very important to separate Ukraine from Biden, and most pro-Ukraine voices, sort of elite Ukrainians in Kyiv, and the pro-Ukrainian people from around the world, well-intentioned. We all have the same objective. Were angry at me and saying, "Why are you talking about Biden? It doesn't matter. That's the past." And I kept trying to explain, well, it's not the past. If you follow what Donald Trump says, he's talking about Biden all the time, even on Easter Sunday.
And
He
Obama,
had
he harks back to all the old, adversaries in his mind.
yeah, and Biden was foremost among them in some ways, and even on Easter Sunday he tweeted that crisis risen and F Joe Biden. So this is a focus, because but if you take the empathy analytical tool, you can see that there is some. I mean, we do have this in America where every side screams at each other, but there is a sense. There was a sense among MAGA people that there were a lot of problems and a lot of corruption as they perceived it under the Biden years, and they were not happy with it. But that was dismissed by everyone. But now we see in the past week, now it's okay to talk about, and I think now people are seeing. So everything I said 4 months ago doesn't sound so crazy now that you have CNN, Washington Post, New York Times, everyone now, almost to a person, Ezra Klein, everyone, even among Democrats, are saying, "Oh, there was a failure of leadership under Biden." So now it's okay to say it, and now it's not only okay to say it; you almost have to say it if you want to have a political future or immediate future in America. So when I was saying that 4 months ago, because I saw that coming, I saw it building up because I knew about the fundamental problems underneath. And the other thing I saw that, like, I see a train wreck that was on the way, is that Ukraine was unfairly and unfortunately so tied to Biden. And unfortunately, Jonathan, it still is. So, for example, when Jake Tapper, he's doing all these shows now talking about this book he wrote about how the media, including him, were pretty wrong. They didn't investigate enough. And in some ways, he's excusing it. In some ways, he's giving a mea culpa. But in almost every conversation, he ends up talking about Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son. And he says that Joe Biden's son made money from China and from Ukraine. And that is not true. It's an absolute falsehood. And this is why for months I've been begging people, please, please help share the truth that Hunter Biden did not work for a Ukrainian company. He never came to Ukraine. Burisma, for which Hunter Biden worked, was based in Moscow. Its CEO had fled after Ukraine's revolution of dignity. He fled to Moscow because he was a pal of Putin, and he was part of the cabal. The CEO Burisma was part of the cabal that wanted Russia to control Ukraine because then they could plunder from this country. And so March 2014, Burisma's CEO hired Hunter Biden and his business partner from Moscow, right when Putin was taking Crimea. And we can look at this and say Burisma wanted Russian control of Ukraine. They hired the son of the United States vice president, and that vice president, who was in charge of Russia and Ukraine policy for Obama, does nothing. That should at least raise some questions. But even beyond that, it is absolutely unfair and unjust to associate Ukraine with Hunter Biden. But here's the problem, Jonathan, is like it's not. So Tucker Carlson does that all the time, but so does Jake Tapper, so does CNN and the BBC. And the effect of this is this: that MAGA, which includes Republicans and Democrats, who are tired of the old way of doing things, they're tired of it. This is a revolution that's happening in America, and it's all continually reinforced in their mind that Ukraine and Biden are tied together. And so even now, when everyone's attacking Biden, you know who else goes down with that ship in the eyes of most Americans? Ukraine. Because no one has wanted to investigate and tell the actual truth, which is plainly staring us in the face. We have congressional testimony from Hunter Biden's business partner, Devin Archer, from 2023, where he's kind of a dummy. He almost just he's like, oh, yeah, geez. I was in Moscow the day that Putin took Crimea, and I was meeting with the CEO of Burisma. Like, oh, maybe this is, not Ukrainian. And this is precisely why, to me, it's of the utmost importance to tell the story of what happened in 2014. And very notably, when Joe Biden issued, or whoever was in charge, issued the pardon for Hunter Biden, which I support. I support the presidential pardon power, unfettered and unquestioned. But when he pardoned Hunter Biden, the pardon went back to 2014. What? Why? what about that year was so special? Well, that was the year that Hunter Biden made the deal with Burisma, which was then based in Moscow. And but the problem is, everyone. Glenn Beck just posted this a couple of days ago. So from Glenn Beck to Jake Tapper, they're all saying that it was a deal with the Ukrainian company that is a falsehood. It is a lie. It is wrong. It is bad reporting, and it is pulling Ukraine down with the Biden ship. And the other quickly the other way that Ukraine goes down with the Biden ship is this. So Biden is perceived as having helped Ukraine. For those who are not paying attention, like we were, we have to remember all the frustrations we had with Jake Sullivan and Biden and the whole team
We
restricting
were,
Ukraine.
our conversation was perhaps one of the first to actually call that out. And I started doing episodes on this guy called Jake Sullivan when very few people in the ecosystem even knew who he was. And very few were even really aware of what that national security role envisaged there and how powerful it was, And I think we helped to shape in some ways the narrative around that, and very much so because, we'll get into this in a minute. Biden had a very curious strategy. I mean, you think maybe there's some links there to trying to cover up for the scandal. I interpret it a more a geopolitical thing, but either way, it's a catastrophic failure of analysis and leadership. And I think we're completely aligned on that. I'll let you finish your sentence, and then we'll dive into that.
Well, I would say, I mean, even so, the level I think that's most important, at which we should really analyze this and talk about it, is firstly, how is this perceived? So, we look at Biden's time in office, and we see all the firstly, I think we think of all the times he restricted Ukraine. When Ukraine was seizing the advantage, Ukraine had opened up opportunities, and they were stymied and stopped, and he basically created a safe space for Moscow to attack Ukraine. That's what we see. But at regular, Americans who are not focused on Ukraine like we are, and so we're not keenly paying attention, they don't see that. They just hear about the billions that they think Biden gave here, because he said that. Because if you say you gave billions of dollars, it looks like you're doing something in the old way. Now people are tired of that. So the average American, when they hear Biden, they think he gave all this money to Ukraine. They think that he gave Ukraine so many weapons that was going to push us into World War III, when it was really the opposite. There's some inversion. He gave just enough weapons to make World War III more likely, but never letting Ukraine win, which would actually prevent the World War III. But if you're average American thinking about this, for them, Biden and Ukraine means he gave Ukraine too much in a too violent way, and he did it because his son made money from Ukraine. Now, this is not accurate, but this is what people think. So what we have to do is to separate that and to show actually that Joe Biden, part of his failure, because now everyone's talking about his failures. Let's make it clear then, his failures were the ways he restricted Ukraine. And see, even in the White House, and I'm pretty confident in this, their picture of Ukraine is of a country that cannot win. And that's only, they don't know why, they just know that's their picture. And the reason why is because Biden made it so. So all they see is the end product, that Ukraine couldn't get it done in 3 years. What they don't see is the moments when Ukraine was getting it done and was restricted, and the opportunities were wasted. They don't see that. No one talks about it. And the reason why no one talks about it, because as long as Biden and Ukraine are tied in this corruption narrative, they don't even care. They don't even have an incentive to go further, to investigate.
Well, let's go on to that because I think that narrative idea is absolutely critical. We'll unpack the failure of leadership, and then we'll unpack why there are issues. But just to close out that point on manipulation, I mean, if we sort of step back, I think there's a failure to see the wood from the trees on all sides, actually, within the American media. In fact, all media, that includes, big chunks of the European media as well. And that is, if you look at Burisma being mislabeled from ignorance or whatever, and you step back, it becomes more probable that this was actually a Russian operation, that this was an operation to entrap Biden and create the ability to then manipulate political discourse in the US. That cannot be taken off the table as a distinct possibility because that's how they operate. That's how they try to destabilize Ukraine, by buying off oligarchs, by compromat, from injecting money and bribing officials and so on, having assets, agents, and compromised individuals throughout a system. This is the same game they're playing here, it seems to me, with Burisma. Then you have the Steele dossier. The Steele dossier potentially, this juicy little nugget of compromat supposedly on Trump, but they fed it to Democrats who unfortunately seemed to fall for it and then commissioned that work to be done. That then inflamed the entire media system. Look at this stuff on Trump. Some of it was barely plausible, which meant it was easy for Trump in particular, but his media machine to dismiss it and laugh at it. And actually, many Trump supporters, many MAGA supporters, contrary to popular image. I mean, some, probably don't know what's going on, but some look at this and they're like, this smells odd. This just does not
Yeah.
feel correct. And they see the whole of the mainstream centrists and leftist media pushing this narrative, but it's barely plausible. Again, if we take it away from the sort of partisanship, we can see that this may well be a clever instrument of Russian intelligence services really, manipulating both sides in the US political discourse for their own ends. That's the most remarkable thing about this, I think.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to that tool of empathy, the Russians actually use it very well because they have the patience to listen.
They don't
They
have it, but
listen
they
to the
know how to
people.
manipulate it, right? That's the irony
Yeah,
here, yeah.
yeah, well, they don't. Yeah, you're right. They don't have it when it comes to like their own people, or when it comes to the Ukrainians who they want to kill, or Europeans they want to kill. They don't have it in a sense. It's not so their sense. There's no dignity to it. They use it solely for manipulation. So it's empathy minus dignity, but it still is empathy because they will listen. They listen very well to the American mood, and they know how to press the pain points. And that's why that's the instrument of their power, their sort of soft power. And I think if you look at this, so as we see in the past week with the news, all the news now, and John Stewart did a great job talking about this. He calls out the hypocrisy very nicely. He says, "Look, the media now is trying to get you to buy a book about how the media failed to tell you what they should have told you, what you already kind of knew about Joe Biden's mental unfitness, and now the media is trying to make themselves the saints." John Stewart much more eloquently on this, but like they're the ones that caused the problem, and more than that, they're the ones that told everyone else, "Shut up, you're not allowed to ask questions. If you ask questions, you're against old people or something." Like they really did shut it down, and they try to make a little mea culpa, but they still want to keep their moral authority, and people are sick of that. And this is the same reason why. So this can help people understand MAGA more. They're like we see here that the media is admitting that they prevented a proper investigation, right? And they shut down discourse. They admit that now. Well, so that means that this is quite a problem, and this is not. And so it's actually a fundamental problem with the American media, and it's gonna. Why should you trust any media like that? And so this is what happens. When all the media in 2022, most of it was saying support Ukraine, that alone is enough to make a lot of people in America say, yeah, if you support it, I'm not going to do it because you guys have been lying to us too much. And this is the problem with being dishonest and not allowing true conversation. You lose, and so then everything you say becomes something that the situation we're in when it comes to Ukraine, to telling the story of Ukraine with MAGA.
And of course, coming to your point there, and this really starts to get to what you're doing, what I'm sort of trying to do, but what you're uniquely doing, and that is to try to understand, not say whether they're right or wrong, but understand the sort of mindset and impulses that led to people voting for Trump and which leads people to stick with him, despite, some of the dare I say it, chaos that he's brought in his wake. It's barely shifted public perceptions at all, despite what people may think or hope for. And what you're trying to do is to take this little pill of goodness, this little medicinal pill, which we could call pro-Ukraine objective information, And you're like, this is going to be instantly rejected by the MAGA body because of all the stuff we've talked about. The misinformation, the misplaced information, the ignorance of certain issues, and of course, the internal trauma that's going on in American society, which means that people are going to be saying, hang on a second, we've got a lot of problems on our side. Let's deal with that before we even think about other people's problems. And that's kind of understandable. I mean, the Russians do the same. Everybody, to a greater or lesser extent, actually does the same. And you're taking this little bit of medicinal information and you're trying to put a coating around it so that the body won't reject it. You're trying to inject this good information into the MAGA ecosystem. And actually, some of it is working. Anyone who's been following Ben Shapiro since he came to Kiev, and I know you were very influential in making that happen. He has made some of the strongest, pithiest, and powerful statements about why Ukraine needs to win and what Russia is as an adversary. He's saying some extraordinarily good things. So this strategy here, how did how do you do that? And why do you think it's so important to inject this good information into the MAGA ecosystem?
Well, that's one thing I say when I go on podcast debating anti-Ukraine people, Americans, many of them who would identify as MAGA. I firstly say, look, I think I'm not expecting in this conversation that you're going to all of a sudden want to support Ukraine, but can you at least not lie about Ukraine? Not say, that, for example, the Hunter Biden made money from Ukraine. Let's at least not, or that Christians are oppressed in Ukraine when this is the most Christian country in Europe.
Although Russian-speaking Ukrainians are Russian and not, I mean, when you look at that example
Yeah.
argument, it's completely absurd. It's like saying, well, hang on, see, you speak English, so what? You're British or what? I mean, you can just imagine doing that
Or
in
Canadian. Maybe you're
Scotland,
Canadian.
Ireland, Canada. You get your face punched in, but people don't really kind of translate it, as it were.
Yeah, and I think so. I start with that and say, I because let's start with that. Let's just say, hey, at least stop attacking Ukraine unfairly. Like, okay, maybe you don't want to send money. That's a different argument. But let's start with this, and I think that's what first step. Second, I don't like the word misinformation, and I don't like it because I also know Americans don't like it. Because so, a year ago, if you questioned Joe Biden's mental fitness, Jake Tapper and everyone would have accused you of that word misinformation, which means shut up, don't ask questions, go home. And we see now that, oh, wait, in this case, the misinformation was actually coming from those who said the word misinformation. And so I think it's very important. We have to really remember this, like John Stuart Mill idea, this deep democratic value of free and open discourse. That's the pursuit of truth. Truth doesn't just fall into our laps. We find it through conversation. We have to talk with each other with empathy. And so I avoid the word misinformation because I don't really know what it means. And usually now when Americans hear it, that drives them to think the opposite because they're so tired of sort of having their discourse managed and sometimes falsely, as we see in these revelations from the past week about Biden. So I think though that's an important thing to remember as we discuss all this. Like, and it's about firstly, let's share the reality that what I try to do is share the reality that I see around me in Ukraine every day, and in a way that that I hope or I think that people in America can appreciate. And for example, it's JD Vance is he converted to Catholicism in 2019, and a lot of people they don't like him and they want to dismiss him, but he's written about his conversion. He actually did a fascinating podcast with Ross Douthat of the New York Times. Ross, an old friend of mine from Rome, because JD was in Rome for the Pope's inaugural mass, and he and Ross had a fascinating conversation. And I would encourage anyone who wants to understand what's happening in America to listen to a conversation like that, because it is a window into how he thinks. And he's a very thoughtful guy when he's talking about his faith conversion story. And, for me, I think often these things are quite simple. If JD Vance knew that Western Ukraine was probably the most actively religious and actively Catholic regions of Europe, he would at least start investigating the situation more.
And change his perception a little bit. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, but he doesn't even.
Yeah.
He's so blinded by Biden, Burisma, and also by the Iraq War, the war machine. He was in the American military. We have to remember that trauma. Americans, believe the George W. rah rah rah, and now they say no more of that. Okay, and so that is enough. They don't want to listen or anything. So Ukraine is total in their minds. It's part of that. But if JD Vance were to realize that, oh wait, Ukraine, west of Ukraine, the churches are crowded. You can hear the chant spilling out into the streets. It is the most faithful part of Europe because a big, JD Vance in particular, like in Munich, he was saying, "Oh, Europe has lost its values," which is crazy because here in Ukraine, all the values that he said are lost are being defended. People are actually literally fighting for it, not just talking about it, but fighting for it. But here's where we get to this idea of the tool of empathy. So Pope Leo met with JD Vance, and but I guarantee you, Pope Leo had no idea that JD Vance doesn't know that Western Ukraine is Catholic. But Pope probably just assumes that you would know that because that's he knows that. He knows it better than Francis, I think. By the way, but
he seems to, doesn't he? He seems very tuned in.
And that's one thing I didn't mention earlier, but it's very important. He talked about human dignity and artificial intelligence, and Ukraine has been one of the top 3 topics. And he calls Ukraine a martyr, which is the highest compliment you can give from the Catholic Church. The martyr, people who, it's not an Islamic martyr, it's a martyr, an innocent person who is made into a sacrifice. And so he's focused on that. And the Western the Catholics in Lviv, for example, they're Greek, so it's called Greek Catholicism. It's weird, it's hard to understand. This is why the BBC, for example, has never explained it. It looks Orthodox, prima facie. On the face of it, it looks Orthodox. It's part of the Catholic Church, and it is this sort of union of East and West. But I guarantee you, Pope Leo didn't know that two things he didn't know. He didn't know that JD Vance doesn't know that, and he also didn't know, and this is the key, that if JD Vance knew that, that could change his entire perspective on Ukraine. And it is actually that simple. And so the reason why I say this is I'm encouraging everyone watching and part of this community that you built, Jonathan, who cares about Ukraine, not to give up hope that we can change things, but actually to use our energy to examine, okay, let's read, let's just take the case of JD Vance here. Let's read what he's written. Let's watch his interviews about his most personal story, conversion, and see if there's any way to make some commonality there. Because if we give up hope that we can do that, then I don't see much hope. I mean, I see a very bleak situation for Ukraine. It's because what are we going to do? We're going to wait, 3.5 years for a new, hoping that there might be a new Biden, Jake Sullivan again, which is a slow death. That's not a solution either. So
no,
I think
we need to definitely not
apply our. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely not a solution. We'll come to that in a second because I think this catastrophic failure of leadership is why we're at where we're at and why so many of these narratives have been perpetuated. And I know you're trying to sort of draw that out, and not just the strategic incompetence, but the absolute failure of communications during the Biden administration to explain what they're doing, why they're doing it, and indeed to release some of those communications with extremely poor timing that actually reflects badly, again, on Ukraine, no fault of Ukraine itself. One thing that could be leveled at Ukraine, and this is where we're going to get sort of hopefully not controversial, but hopefully constructive. If we're approaching this as you are, and as I'm trying to do, as marketeers, as communications people, as opposed to, just pure activists or media people, what we see here is that the message isn't working. The moral argument did cut some ice with Biden and his circle to say, like, Ukraine as a democracy has right on its side. Okay, they didn't get what they needed. We'll come to that in a minute. But at least those messages, and to an extent the virtue signaling, that was picked up and reflected by Biden and his people. They could see the moral argument, even if action wasn't, taken according to what was being expressed. There's a sort of disparity there between we believe in these things, we believe in the essential rightness of Ukraine's cause, but we're not going to back that up with decisive action. That message is not working. That message, the moral argument, the argument that we're victims, that history is on our side, that doesn't cut through. Because as it's been pointed out, Trump and his people are extremely transaction in their attitude. It is just the wrong message. Now we could bang our heads against the wall and saying Trump is wrong or that's a worldview that we don't like, that's not going to cut any ice for Ukraine. So how can Ukrainian activists change their narrative from, the victim card, the moral card, to actually switch it up to things that do resonate with Trump, and in particular, strength and winning, and of course the transactional thing. Well, they've tried that with the minerals deal. It partially worked. But I think it doesn't quite track, it doesn't quite counter the Russian narrative that they're strong and they're winning when they're not. Ukraine needs to perhaps adopt these. So what's your view on changing the narrative?
Well, I think firstly, strategically, we have to always remember, if you're pro Ukraine, the frustrations you had with Joe Biden, and just keep that in your mind to temper your rhetoric when speaking about Trump, because it was easy to fall into this like pit of despair and being actually becoming a bit nasty in our language because people are so angry. But let's remember, Biden was, we were not on a plan to victory under Biden, and just to give us that perspective, that's the first step. Second, this is the tool of empathy, analytical empathy. Understand why Americans are not supporting Ukraine, and it's not because they're amoral or that they want the Ukrainians to die. It's because they're in their minds, they are sick and tired and frustrated of the old way of Washington.
Sure,
Of the
there's
Henry
more.
Kissinger school.
There's more here, Joe. There's more here, and I think this is where
Mhm.
the Russians are tapping into this. And we don't know exactly how many times Putin speaks to Trump, but he did speak to him last week, and the narrative kind of changed dramatically. And Trump has several times hinted several times that Ukraine doesn't have the cards, Russia is winning, etc. Russia understands that the message of strength and winning gets through to him personally. They absolutely do. And they're utilizing that. They're using this methodology and it is successful. It's cutting through. So I think, yeah, if we go beyond the partisan thing, what do we do to adopt narratives that actually are going to resonate with Trump individually? Because he has an inordinate amount of power in the current system.
I think there's two approaches. One I think is not very helpful, but it'd be better than nothing. So the second approach I think is the ideal way, and that's what I work toward. But the first one is to chip away. That's what's happening now. Chip away a minerals deal. Try to make the case here and there. This is what Zelensky's current approach is, because he's acting as though Trump is the same personality as Biden. Remember when Kharkiv was almost being destroyed in May of 2024? Biden was refusing to let Ukrainians fire back using HIMARS in a way that would protect Kharkiv across the Russian border. Because Jake Sullivan, everyone, they were very scared. That was a big Russian red line. But I think since 2022, that was the most consistent and effective Ukrainian campaign to get support. Everyone was saying, Mr. President Biden, you have to let Ukraine fire back. And that pressure worked, and a limited permission was given, and Kharkiv became safer. That strategy does not work now with Trump, and I even see it like in Zelensky's comments I saw in the Daily Telegraph a couple of weeks ago. You can tell that he's actually thinking that he can just chip away at it, and that's not going to create sort of the sea change that we need. And the reason why, again, and so this is the I think the best method is to fundamentally address why there's a skepticism of Ukraine, why there's a dislike for Ukraine among MAGA and even among Trump, Trump's team. And it is exactly this. It sounds so simple and ridiculous. Burisma and Biden. That's it. Start to correct that. And there's only one person, we can talk here and there. There's only one person that really could do this. And part of this is the way that, Zelensky's team has set it up so that, he's the only voice that's really heard. There's a lot of powerful Ukrainian voices. I want them to be on American podcasts, and that's not happening right now. But so Zelensky's the only one who really could do this. And now that it's super popular to criticize Biden, it's amazing, Jonathan. The only, like, everyone in the world and their cousin's dog is criticizing Biden. The only people not doing it are the Ukrainians, who actually have one of the best criticisms, because he really did. Jake Sullivan and Biden's policies really did it. They hurt Ukraine in two ways: by being slow and not letting Ukraine fight back. But here's the other key way: by making Americans think that all these American resources were coming to Ukraine when they really weren't. And so Ukraine wasn't getting the help, but it got blamed for all the help it got. And so that made Americans super tired of Ukraine. And so Zelensky is in a good and noble and honorable position to make this case. And all he has to do is to say to Donald Trump, ideally in the Oval Office, the reality TV of the Oval Office, and say this, say, Mr. President, Joe Biden prevented us from winning. And your perception of Ukraine is a perception created by Joe Biden. I want to show you the real perception. We are strong. We have the best military in Europe. We have the most battle experienced army in the free world. Here are the innovations we're doing that has taken out a third of Russia's navy in the Black Sea. Like, start pushing these stories, but the hook has to be Joe Biden failed not just Americans, but he also failed. He failed Ukraine, and he failed global security. And if you start and you say, by the way, Burisma is Russian, and if you start with that, all of a sudden you create this opportunity. You give MAGA a chance to love you, and frankly, you have to do that. You have to do it. Give them a reason to love you.
Yeah. And they don't have to necessarily attack him personally, but they do need to call out why his policies are so weak, why there is a catastrophic failure of leadership. I mean, Ukraine could find itself in a difficult position if they go after Biden and attack him personally. And there's a degree of hypocrisy here because, they're being told whatever you do, and this is before, Trump came in, whatever you do, don't attack him personally. You've got to maintain that sort of perception of neutrality because Americans don't like it really when you go after, our guy. And if he's going to win, you're completely screwed. So I think it's got to be careful because if they go after Biden personally, they might lose Democrat support, but not necessarily gain Republican support. And then they're absolutely in a terrible place. But I think it's absolutely right to call out the weakness of the strategy. And of course, the architect of that strategy was Joe Biden. The implementer and the enabler of that strategy was this guy called Jake Sullivan. And it now seems, and you and I have spoken to various people coming from different angles, and we're hearing the same thing, that this wasn't accidental. That Biden and Sullivan's strategy is, okay, Ukraine's asked for this, this, and this to meet their objectives. And Ukraine is asking for these not simply to survive, but to win. But Sullivan and Biden don't want Ukraine to win. They just want them to bleed and survive. They don't want catastrophic collapse on the Ukrainian side. They don't want a catastrophic collapse on the Russian side. It's a kind of idea of maintaining a status quo. The scary thing, of course, is we can see this policy actually echoes all the way down, not just through Democrat presidencies, but we can see this in Bush in his Chicken Kiev speech. We can see this in Obama very clearly. We can even see this in the current administration. They do not want a Ukrainian victory because that destabilizes their conception of the world. With Trump, I think it's like he doesn't even believe that could be possible under any circumstances. And of course, we have to work on that. But there is a commonality of American foreign policy, and that is to try and maintain this kind of fictitious status quo. And the worst case scenario, I think, is that Biden genuinely believed that World War III was possible, that nuclear Armageddon was possible, and Russia used that, and that ultimately a Russian victory is preferable to World War III and preferable to Ukrainian victory. And in fact, if there is a threatened collapse of Russia, and I honestly think, we can't prevent it, whether it's going to happen or not. So let's stop worrying about it. But I think in their minds, the collapse of Russia is to be avoided at all costs, even if that means Ukraine being conquered and subsumed. I genuinely think they believe that. And that's an absolute failure of leadership, an absolute failure of moral vision, an absolute failure of geopolitical strategy, which is masquerading as some kind of geopolitical grand strategy when really all it is appeasement.
Yeah, cowardice. Well, and I think firstly, I when it comes to what Ukraine can say about Biden, I mean, my opinion on this has not changed. I mean, we don't have to deal with kid gloves on this, but now, I mean, if you look, the anger from the left toward Joe Biden, I encourage people to go read the American news the past week. The gloves are off, and because people they're pissed off, and like if it makes sense. I mean, if you're worried about authoritarianism now, well, we had the same back then, but just in a different format because we didn't know who was in charge. So like
I think a lot of
Bernie
people in Europe have
Sanders,
missed this, Joe. I think a lot of people miss this. And
yeah,
I've,
that's why I'm saying this. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. And this includes some of his key campaign staff. So there's one, I don't remember her name, but
Everyone.
there's
Yeah. Mhm.
one of his key campaign staff who gushed throughout the campaign these extraordinary, positive statements about Biden, and Kamala Harris as well. She's come round and just stick the knife in. I find that quite revolting, actually, that you can say one thing and then, turn on a dime and say the absolute opposite. No, but you're right. There are many people who have come out, including many pro Harris people, who now blame Biden for really screwing her campaign over by leaving it to the last minute to essentially resign and withdraw.
Well, and I could listen to the Jake Tapper interview with Katie Couric, in which he is talking about the undue influence of Hunter Biden. He's calling him crackhead and all this. Jake Tapper from CNN, undue influence of Hunter Biden in the White House, and you begin to see a picture of total irresponsible chaos, bordering on unconstitutional. And so, what I want everyone to understand, this is coming from the media and from the left in America. Look at the Washington Post editorial from 3 days ago. So everyone is now it's totally okay and actually almost required, if you want to be in American politics, to be very clear about the personal and people. It's personal, Okay, maybe the only question is, to what degree did Joe Biden know what was happening given his mental decline? But so there's different permutations of that. But that the fact that this was allowed to happen, that your personal story can affect a nation in this way, there's a lot of anger. Bernie Sanders also has been very eloquent about this. He was on a podcast saying, "Yeah, the Democratic Party has violated democracy." Okay, so we need to understand this, because it's exactly the mood right now in America, and so it's a perfect time, actually. Like, what I care about is always being honest and truthful, and then being strategic, so that Ukraine can get the support it needs. And one day, Americans will realize that was also good for America. But first, we got to step by step, malo po malo, little by little, as they say in Ukrainian. And President Zelenskyy, he can change this. And right now is the time to do it. And if he doesn't seize this moment, I really don't think that there's another good chance to win over Americans. And that's a fact. That's how dire and important this is right now. You have everyone criticizing Joe Biden. Zelenskyy has really the best argument against Joe Biden and the Pentagon apparatus. He could lay it all out there, and he could become beloved by MAGA, which is what is needed. You got to become beloved right now by the people who don't already love you. We're reaching the people who, everyone who's on the side of Ukraine, the right side now, already was moved by Mariupol. That's not going to work for the people we're trying to reach. If it was, it would have already worked. And this is not a judgment on the people we're trying to reach. It's saying they haven't seen it because of these other problems, right? Mm-hmm. So Zelenskyy is in a unique position to say, Joe Biden has failed. We saw firsthand the failures for the whole world of Joe Biden. And it's not just Joe Biden. It's a continuation. And this, I think, is the winning line that Zelenskyy can say to Trump. And when you speak to Trump, you're speaking to the Americans. To say this: Washington has lied to all of us. For decades, Washington lied to the American people. Washington lied about the WMDs in Iraq. Say that, because that's true. They lied to us about this. Say it. Washington lied to the American people. And guess what, Americans? This should come from Zelenskyy. Guess what, Americans? Washington lied to the Ukrainians too. In the 90s, both Democrats and Republicans promised us that they would protect us if we gave up our nukes. So we've all been lied to by Washington. And Mr. President Trump, I'm glad now we have a chance to be honest about those lies. We don't have to be afraid anymore. And let's open this up and make it real and honest. And let's stop living in this Henry Kissinger world where we always have to be terrified of the tyrants. And let's really stand for freedom. Give a speech like that. Give the Love Actually speech to the prime minister. That's what Zelenskyy has to do to the American people. And I know it's going to take he's going to have to change his thought process from the past 3 years, but he's got to do it. And he's an actor. He can do it. He's uniquely able to do this, but he's got to do it. And he's got to do it soon.
and the people around him have got to realize, I think, the importance of that, because I think if they snap into a different mode of thinking, then, as you say, he is adaptable, he's versatile, he's extremely eloquent, and he can bring humor to these circumstances, which is almost kind of unique. And as a comedian, he has a high level of empathy. He actually does, because that's part of his professional bread and butter. Ukrainians, however, and this is where we're sort of, nearing the end of this one. Ukrainians, out of all people in Europe, were willing to give Trump the benefit of the doubt. They were far less judging of him while he was in the presidential race, far less judging of him when he came into office, because they were thinking nothing can be worse than what Biden was doing and his sort of drip feeding approach of half measures. Now, however, they find that under Trump, they're getting something far more akin to, rather than be given, half of your dose of medicine, it's far more of a sort of homeopathic remedy. You're getting kind of nothing under the pretense you're getting something, to put it harshly. But Ukrainians aren't sort of turning around and going, oh, Trump this, Trump that. They're just thinking, well, hang on a second, we're on our own. We're on our own. We have to defend ourselves. Yes, we're going to get some stuff from Europe, but it won't be enough to do the full job. Ukrainians are innovating. Ukrainians are building the tools they need to defend themselves against being further overrun by Russia. There's an incredible story here of strength and resilience rather than giving up in the face of adversity. How can we turn this into the narrative? Because this surely is something that will resonate with MAGA Americans. You've got a country that's taken responsibility for its own defense in a way that Europe has not done for decades. You've got a country willing to sacrifice itself for the values it holds dear, including those religious and traditional values you talked about. And then you've got incredible innovation taking place that is defeating what was thought to be the most powerful army in the world. There are some great stories in here. Why are they not being told in the right way?
Well, I think firstly, Jonathan, and I will repeat it, as long as there are these blinders and as long as Ukraine is tainted in the American mind, then there's no interest in diving deeper, going into it. For example, every time Lindsey Graham speaks in favor of Ukraine, it's another nail in the coffin in support for Ukraine because he was such a big voice for the Iraq war. So Americans, when they hear him talk, they're like, yeah, no, thanks. Anything you're associated with, no, thank you. And we have to really understand that. Okay. So this is like all these. So I want to I've been telling these stories. You've been telling these stories. I want people to know about the incredible innovation, which, by the way, can help America with whatever threats we're going to face. And as we routinely see, the American defense industry and their arrogance is woefully unprepared. And when they come to Ukraine, they don't want to look because they realize how little they know. But the fact is, no one who we need to reach is going to listen to any of these stories, any of them, until we correct the foundational myth that makes them not want to listen. And that, again, is Biden and Burisma and Biden's restrictions upon Ukraine. If you don't separate that, none of these arguments and stories are ever going to work, and they're never going to matter. And I have to be very clear about that. It's just not going to work. And now we have a unique opportunity for this to work because everyone's attacking Joe Biden. And unfortunately, while all the Democrats are attacking Joe Biden, they are perpetuating the lies about Ukraine by continually repeating, because they're not even thinking about it, repeating that Joe Biden made money from Ukraine. His kids made money from Ukraine. They keep repeating this. So unless we fix this, nothing else we do. Everything else is rearranging the deck chairs. That's it. And once we do break through this, which I believe we can, then everything's going to be easier then because we have so many good stories to tell, and people will be willing to listen. And I think we always remember the American mind. The Americans, at the cost of losing tradition and all that. I mean, we cut off our roots. People that came to America, sometimes they were forced, like in the case of slavery. But either way, Americans don't have roots in the same way that people in Europe do. But the upside of that is that we can reinvent ourselves, and we can. This is why we love self-help. I want to be a different person than I was yesterday. I was blind and now I see. I encourage everyone to remember this because this is the sign of great hope. You can actually change what might seem impossible. You can actually get people to believe, to support Ukraine when yesterday they were totally opposed to it. If there's any population in the world that is capable of such a radical, rapid change, it is the American people. And I say this in a good way because we are, always want to innovate and make things better. So this is the great hope and chance that we have. We have to recognize it and seize it. And then, I think that Russia's greatest fear is precisely that this would happen. Russia's not afraid deeply of a big alliance between France or Germany and Ukraine because they know that it's probably not going anywhere. But if you do get American commitment, that is the thing that Russia hates the most, and that's why they invest all these resources in muddling the conversation and trying to pit us against each other. And so, again, that's why this tool of radical analytical empathy, really understanding the people we want to reach. And I encourage those who support Ukraine, why don't try this for the next 30 days? Try this radical empathy. Don't insult Trump and the Americans you want to reach. And try and see if we can have some effect. And and realize every era has its own benefits. I mean, all the problems we have with Biden, but there were good things there too. I mean, Ukraine was able to use the HIMARS to really transform the war. We have a lot of good stories too, and I would say the good thing now, the problem under Biden we faced a slow bleed. Now the way Trump operates, we're forced quickly to confront things in a way. And we just have to be smart about how we participate in that confrontation. I think Trump is we're not quick enough from the perspective here, but he is realizing that Russia has no interest. And as Lavrov said the other day, he basically is saying it now, like, we're not really interested in any ceasefire. And
it's becoming
I think
clearer.
Soon enough.
I mean, unfortunately,
we wish it would...
we've been saying this for months, and it's taken
we know it.
4 or 5 months for this to kind of sink in. The challenge here, and this is the very, very last question, is Trump now has 2 options. One option, well, he has 3 options. One is neutrality. And I think Ukrainians actually are thinking, you know what, neutrality is maybe the best we can hope for. He could go all in for Ukraine. There are many pro-Ukrainians who are empathetic with Margot saying, yeah, he's going to do this. I don't see any evidence that he's going to go all in for Ukraine. The worst case scenario, however, is equally realistic based on the things he's said. And that is, he could say, do you know what? We're going to wash our hands of this whole thing. We're going to try and lift sanctions because let's just carry on and do business because business makes sense. And, that's his worldview. The worst case scenario could be that he actually seeks to normalize relations with Russia, lift sanctions, and wash his hands of everything. That's not neutrality. That is essentially supporting the aggressor. And we got to acknowledge that's a risk. How do we prevent that from happening?
This is precisely. I mean, I think about this all the time. I mean, and it could even be worse than you say. I mean, you could actively arm Russia against Ukraine. And this is precisely why we have to keep. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, we have to stay cool and strategic, and not give up yet because it's not decided. We are living in the most. Donald Trump had that TV show, The Apprentice, and now it's the Apprentice Oval Office edition. I just made a video about this at JP Lindsley on Instagram. It is a reality TV show with the most important consequences for the whole world. And you see all these foreign leaders going to appear in the Oval Office, and they have their chance to make their case. Some do well, some don't. And this is because we know the great danger that we face. We really have to find a way to make the case. And you don't do it by insulting and screaming or shaming people. It usually doesn't work, especially not with Americans and those Americans who are in power. You have to understand, go back to the analytical empathy. What do they want? And not you can't, you really have to try. It's very difficult. You have to try to remove your own cynicism and really say, what is the good thing in their hearts that they want to achieve? Find that first and begin to work from there and to appeal to that. Or why, and maybe the more important question is, why can they not see things the way I see things? And I think there we'll see, because Burisma Biden has done such damage. And so once we realize that, then we can begin to construct a story that can change it. And let's remember that because the anti-Ukraine impressions They've had 3 years to develop. It's not an it's a simple thing to change, but it's not easy because it's deeply ingrained. So the only way you're going to change it is kind of like with in a marketing, Jonathan. I mean, you need some dramatic sea change campaign. It can't be subtle. You can't be subtle now. And the good thing is, like, there's a huge opportunity now with all of this gloves off criticism of Joe Biden. Ukraine doesn't have to be subtle. And you know what? I'd rather criticize Joe Biden than if it saves Ukrainian lives. Sure, fine. Politicians can take it, and so I think this is why. And Zelenskyy is a showman, and as a man of integrity and dignity, he can make the case. Ukraine is a revolution of dignity. It's a revolution of the idea of dignity, and a way to rejuvenate this idea for all the world, for Americans in particular, if we're talking to Americans, but also for Europeans and Africans and everywhere. Ukraine shows that the little guy can win. The free person can win against tyranny. This is what this is about. And again, the way to get that, you have to remember, why do people not want to listen to you? Find that reason and start with something that they want to hear and work from that.
Joe, I think this is incredibly important sea change in how to approach pro-Ukraine communications and activism. I hope people will listen to this, take some of it on board, and they will start experimenting in the way you're doing without doing the sort of screaming at each other, flinging mud kind of thing, which so many people seem to sort of, fall into as a matter of instinct. I think some people actually enjoy that process. But they really need to pull their heads out of their backsides and get on with the primary objective, which is how do we get Ukrainian victory, and how do we convince those that have the material that is required for that victory to get on board with the cause. Joe, thank you for everything you're doing. Thank you for all the time you've given over today, and when I was in Lviv as well, where we were sort of stewing and throwing back some of these ideas backwards and forwards. It's always enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Jonathan, thank you for your work and for creating this place to figure things out together and to victory. We keep going. So I encourage everyone to follow me at JP Lindsley on X and Instagram and YouTube. And I challenge everyone, 30 days. Let's see if we can change the way we communicate and get some success. So, дуже дякую from Lviv, Ukraine. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.